Just when you think you've got a handle on things, the ground shifts. And right now, in Hungary, well, the ground's shifting pretty dramatically regarding LGBTQ plus rights, the latest. A ban on pride events.
It's a really significant development, yeah. And it prompts a lot of questions, what's driving this? What does it mean for the future there? And maybe even beyond Hungary.
Okay, let's try and unpack this, because we've got a really interesting mix of materials for this deep dive. We're looking at reports from Human Rights Watch, Al Jazeera, AP News.
Right, and there's also that discussion on the REAP forum, which is quite raw, plus official stuff from the European Parliament, survey data specific to Hungary.
Wikipedia for background,
Yep.
and some analysis from the Institut Jacques Delors. It's quite the spread.
It is. You get the human rights angle, the news reports, individual reactions online, the EU's formal position, the actual lived experience from the surveys, context, and then that higher level analysis. A full picture, hopefully.
So the mission for us today really is to sift through all this, pull out the most important bits, and get a clear understanding of these new restrictions in Hungary and what they imply. We want to give you that comprehensive view without getting, totally bogged down. Ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's start with the actual legislation. What exactly does this new law do?
Right. So the headline basically is this new law effectively stopping LGBT pride events. That alone feels like a major move.
It is. And the way the Hungarian government is framing it is, well, it's through this lens of protecting children. They're using language about shielding kids from woke ideology and gender madness. That framing is really important here.
The classic think of the children angle. Seems like that's the justification for some pretty big legal changes, too.
Precisely. Both Al Jazeera and Human Rights Watch mention these constitutional amendments. One key change basically says a child's right to proper physical, mental, and moral development now outweighs almost all other fundamental rights. The only exception is the right to life.
Wow. That sounds incredibly broad.
Yeah.
What are the concerns about wording like that?
Well, critics, like Al Jazeera points out, worry it's intentionally vague. The fear is it can be twisted to restrict all sorts of public expression and assembly, not just LGBTQ plus events, though they seem to be the immediate target.
Right.
And Human Rights Watch echoes that. They argue it misuses child protection rhetoric to actually clamp down on freedom of assembly and speech. Their point is crucial. Kids need protection from violence and discrimination, not from diversity itself.
And the constitutional changes go further, don't they?
They do. The Constitution's also being changed to explicitly ban the depiction or promotion of homosexuality to minors. It sort of builds on previous laws, making the legal basis for limiting LGBTQ plus visibility even stronger.
So it's not just about the events themselves, but about controlling information and representation, especially for young people.
That's the worry, yeah. And there's more. The Constitution will now officially recognize only male and female sexes. Al Jazeera noted this directly reinforces the existing ban on same-sex adoption by defining mother as female and father as male right there in the Constitution.
Gosh, it really sounds like they're trying to build a legal wall against, well, any recognition of LGBTQ plus lives at a very fundamental level.
That's a good way of putting it. And the discussion over on REAP, it pretty much reflects that concern. Lots of users see it as another breach of EU laws, another step back for fundamental rights.
Yeah.
And there's this unease, people worrying about wider implications, some even drawing parallels to trends they see elsewhere, like in the U.S.
And the vote itself wasn't exactly quiet, was it? I saw in the AP article that opposition lawmakers tried to disrupt it.
That's right, yeah. They used air horns during the vote, a small gesture, maybe, but a clear sign of protest against what was happening.
So Hungary passes these restrictions, uses child protection as the reason, but the reaction, clearly, has been anything but accepting. Let's dig into those criticisms. Human Rights Watch, you said, was quite direct.
Very direct. Their main point, as we mentioned, is that this whole child protection argument is, well, a cover, a way to suppress basic rights and encourage discrimination.
Right.
They stress that real child protection means shielding kids from actual harm, violence, discrimination, not from just knowing that different kinds of people and families exist. It's an old playbook, sadly, using child welfare to target minorities.
And Al Jazeera also flagged the language in those constitutional changes as potentially problematic.
Yes, specifically that bit giving precedence to a child's moral, physical, and spiritual development. The concern is that terms like that are so subjective, so open to interpretation, they could easily be used to shut down any public gathering the government doesn't like, far beyond just LGBTQ plus stuff.
Like a kind of catch-all justification for suppression.
Right.
And the Reeb Forum, you said, was buzzing about this.
Oh, definitely. The feeling there is overwhelmingly negative. People see it as a clear violation of EU rules and basic human rights. There's a lot of frustration, too, aimed at the EU for not doing more, maybe. And some are worried this sets a bad precedent, potentially encouraging other places to try similar things.
I saw one comment you pulled out, stupidest, but think of the children I've ever seen. That really sums up the cynicism, doesn't it?
It really does. It captures that widespread feeling that the government's stated reasons just don't ring true. And these aren't just abstract concerns. There was a really powerful comment from a trans person in Austria.
Oh, yeah?
Sharing their own fear about the rise in this kind of anti-LGBTQ plus talk, worrying about it spreading.
Wow, that really brings it home. It shows the real anxiety these laws create, even across borders. And there was also worry this wasn't only about LGBTQ plus events.
That's a really important point raised on REAP. Some users think this constitutional change, prioritizing this vague moral development over peaceful assembly, could just be a tool to suppress any protest the government dislikes, whatever the cause.
The classic slippery slope concern,
Yeah.
but maybe quite valid here. So, okay, the international community obviously noticed. What was the immediate response from groups like the EU, the UN?
It was pretty fast and mostly critical. The European Parliament info shows that ambassadors from 22 countries, many of them EU states, put out a joint statement they were deeply concerned.
22 countries, that's significant.
Yeah, they specifically called out the restrictions on peaceful assembly and free expression and restated their commitment to human rights for everyone, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity.
Strong words. What about the European Commission itself? Did they weigh in?
They did. They condemned the law directly, said it violates the fundamental right to peaceful assembly. The Commissioner for Equality, Hajj Labib, expressed solidarity with the LGBTQI plus community in Hungary and, well, across the whole EU.
And the UN.
The UN human rights spokesperson also expressed deep concern, called the law arbitrary, discriminatory. They called for Hungary to repeal it, actually, along with other anti-LGBTQI plus laws. And the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights also asked Hungary's parliament to rethink the whole thing.
Okay, so a chorus of international criticism.
Yeah.
What about actual legal challenges? Can these bans be fought in European courts?
Yes, there are a few ways this could happen. Our backgrounder on the EU response mentions the ongoing legal case the European Commission already has against Hungary over previous LGBTQ plus rights violations.
Ah, so there's already a legal fight happening.
Exactly. That case, challenging earlier anti-LGBT laws, could definitely be relevant to these new restrictions, too. And ultimately, it'll be the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, that's the EU's top court, that decides if Hungary's laws break EU law and the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Right, the ECJ handles EU law specifically. That sounds like it could take a while, though.
It likely will. But individuals affected by the bans could also potentially take cases to the European Court of Human Rights, the ECHR. That's a different court.
Okay, how's that different?
The ECHR deals with violations of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a broader treaty under the Council of Europe, not just the EU. So people could argue their rights under that convention have been violated.
Got it. Two different potential legal routes. And that Institute Jacques Delors analysis highlighted something pretty unusual about the existing EU case, didn't it?
It really did. They pointed out that 15 EU member states, plus the European Parliament, have formally intervened in the Commission's case against Hungary. That's apparently unprecedented.
15 states joining the lawsuit.
Essentially, yes, supporting the Commission. The analysis calls it a sign of a growing community-based approach to defending fundamental rights. It's like the member states are collectively saying, we're concerned too, and we back this legal action. It's the first time so many states have jumped in on a case mainly about the EU's own Charter of Rights.
That does sound like the EU trying to show a more united front, even if the wheels of justice turn slowly. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Away from the legal and political side, what's the actual real-world impact of this stuff on LGBTQ plus people living in Hungary day to day? That survey data sounded pretty bleak.
It is quite concerning, yeah. The EU's LGBTI survey data for Hungary shows some stark figures, like 72% of LGBTQ plus people there say they often or always avoid holding hands with a same-sex partner in public because they're afraid. That's way higher than the EU average.
72%.
Mm-hmm.
Just avoiding holding hands. That's such a basic thing to feel you can't do safely.
Exactly. And it's not just holding hands. 40% said they often or always avoid certain places entirely out of fear of being attacked. Again, higher than the EU average.
It really suggests a background level of hostility, maybe even danger, that people are constantly navigating.
Mm-hmm.
What about just feeling able to be open about who they are?
Well, only 32% in Hungary feel they can often or always be open about being LGBT. Compare that to the EU average of 47%. It points to a society where many feel they just have to hide a part of themselves.
And this isn't just about safety in public or feeling comfortable, right? It affects work, other parts of life.
Oh, absolutely. The survey found 23% had experienced discrimination at work in the year before, and almost half, 49%, felt they'd been discriminated against in at least one area, like, going to a cafe, a shop, even a hospital.
So pervasive,
Yeah.
affecting just normal, everyday activities. And it sounds like most people don't even report these things.
Tragically, yes. The reporting rates are incredibly low. Only 5% who experienced a physical or sexual attack reported it to the police. And just 6% reported discrimination incidents to an equality body or somewhere similar. It suggests either a lack of faith in the system or maybe a feeling that it's pointless, that nothing will change.
And what did the survey say about whether things are getting better or worse? People's perception of prejudice.
It was mixed, but definitely worrying. A big chunk, 41%, felt prejudice and intolerance had actually increased in the last 5 years. Only 34% thought it had dropped. And crucially, hardly anyone, just 5%, believe the national government is actually doing anything effective to combat prejudice.
Wow, 5%. That's a pretty damning view of the government's role, or lack of one. What about schools for young LGBTQ plus people?
Schools are also tough. While maybe slightly fewer kids felt they had to hide their identity compared to older surveys, it's still a lot. 36% of LGBTI students felt they had to hide who they were at school. And get this, only 16% said their school education ever talked about LGBTQ plus issues in a way that was positive or even just balanced.
So schools are mostly failing to be supportive or even informative environments. You mentioned some personal quotes from the survey, too.
Yes, and they really hit home. One lesbian woman talked about feeling forced to hide her whole life, never being truly herself because of how LGBTQ plus people are portrayed by politicians and the media. Another lesbian woman basically said her rights aren't protected in Hungary, and she's actually planning to leave the country once she finishes her studies to find somewhere more tolerant. These are the kinds of choices people feel they have to make.
Those stories are just, heartbreaking. They show the real human cost behind these laws and the whole atmosphere they create. Okay, let's zoom out again. Look at the bigger picture, the history here. This latest ban, it didn't come out of nowhere, right? Hungary's government has been moving this way for a while.
That's right. Wikipedia provides a good overview. The Fidesz government under Viktor Orban has a track record, really, of passing laws that chip away at LGBTQ plus rights. Remember that 2021 law, the one banning the promotion of homosexuality and transsexuality to minors?
Yes, I remember the uproar about that one.
Exactly. That drew huge criticism from lots of EU countries. And as we said, it's what led to the European Commission taking legal action in the first place.
So this pride ban is like another turn of the screw, building on those earlier restrictions. And the AP News article noted some interesting timing related to politics.
It did. It points out these new measures come as Hungary looks towards elections in 2026, and apparently Orban's party isn't doing as well in the polls against a new challenger. So the context suggests this might be at least partly about firing up their conservative base, rallying support before the election. Identifying a minority group to target can be a way to energize certain voters.
A grimly familiar political tactic, sadly. And the government's language seems to be getting harsher, too.
Definitely. AP reported Orban comparing civil rights groups and anti-corruption campaigners to insects and talking about eliminating a shadow army of foreign-funded groups. It paints a picture of a government really hostile to dissent or anyone advocating for minority rights.
And we saw hints of this earlier, too, didn't we? Like that incident with the musical Billy Elliot a few years back.
Yes. The cancellation of Billy Elliot in 2018 after a pro-government paper claimed the show could turn kids gay. It's a perfect example of this trend. And then in 2020, remember the government ordering warning labels on a children's book because it showed behavior inconsistent with traditional gender roles.
Right, I remember that. It's a clear pattern of trying to erase any positive or even neutral depiction of LGBTQ plus lives from the public space, especially where kids might see it. Okay, so we've talked about the EU condemning this, the legal options. But what about the EU's actual power to enforce its values here? The REIP discussion touched on this.
Yeah, the limits of the EU's toolkit are a big part of the conversation. There's Article 7 of the EU Treaty. That's the mechanism for potentially suspending a member state's rights, like voting rights, if they seriously breach EU values.
The so-called nuclear option.
Exactly. But it's really hard to trigger. It needs unanimous agreement from all the other member states, which is politically very tricky to get. And like some REIP users noted, even if Hungary lost its voting rights, it would still be an EU member.
And didn't someone mention an argument about exemptions in free speech laws?
Right. That came up in the REIP thread, too.
Yeah.
EU law does allow countries some leeway on free speech protections if it's about protecting their own understanding of public health or morals. Hungary is definitely trying to frame this ban under that kind of exemption protecting children's moral development.
But it's not a blank check, presumably.
No, not at all. The European Court of Human Rights has been pretty consistent in similar cases. Any restriction like that has to be really necessary, proportionate, lawful, and have clear objective reasons. A government can't just say morality and restrict fundamental rights without strong justification.
Okay. And it's clear there isn't total agreement within the EU on how to handle member states like Hungary on these issues, right?
Definitely not. The Institute's Jacques Delors analysis really highlights that tension. The EU has to balance upholding fundamental rights with respecting the different cultural and social views across its members. It's not always easy to find that balance. Plus, major actions like kicking a country out, that needs total unanimity, which just isn't realistic right now.
So despite the loud condemnations and the lawsuits, the EU's ability to force immediate drastic change seems kind of limited. But as we said, the Jacques Delors piece also suggested things might be shifting slowly.
Yes, they talked about the growing normative power of the EU's fundamental rights. Basically, these values are becoming more central, and there's more willingness among member states to act together when they see them being breached. That unprecedented intervention by the 15 states in the lawsuit, that's seen as proof of this shift protecting rights, is becoming more of a shared collective responsibility.
Interesting. So maybe a gradual strengthening of the EU's resolve, even if the tools are still a bit cumbersome. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the absolute key takeaways from looking at Hungary's pride ban and everything around it?
Well, first, it's clearly a significant and worrying step back for LGBTQ plus rights in Hungary, wrapped in this child protection rhetoric. Second, it's drawn strong international condemnation and raises serious questions, not just about the impact on the already challenged LGBTQ plus community there, but also about the rule of law inside the EU itself.
And third, perhaps, is that this is complex. There are legal fights happening, but also ongoing debates and, let's say, limitations on how effectively the EU can enforce its own core values when a member state pushes back like this.
Exactly. That collective action by the member states in the court case is a positive sign, maybe, of growing resolve, but the real-world outcomes and how long they might take, that's still very much uncertain.
So final thought then for everyone listening. When you consider all these different viewpoints, the legal angles, the political pressures, the very real human stories we heard from that survey, what do you think is the most effective way forward? How can international groups or even just individuals best support LGBTQ plus rights in Hungary and push for fundamental freedoms to be upheld across the whole European Union? Definitely something to keep thinking about.